Hey guys, this is Mr. Nettles. Where we last left off, we were talking about plot. And plot is a sequence of events that tells a story. We were using Freytag's pyramid and this plot diagram to help us to create our story. And we were in the rising action part. Now, if you remember, Exposition introduces the characters, setting, and the conflict, and then it moves to the rising action. Now, the rising action is actually most of every story or movie that you ever see. Rising action builds and builds and builds, and it goes up and then comes down, and then goes up and comes down with events that go through until it gets to the climax. And the climax is then the most exciting part of the story. And then falling action, where it starts to uh, relax and calm down. The resolution is then finally found, and then the ending. And everything closes up with a neat bow, and it's all finished. Let's go ahead and continue reading our story. Where we last left off, Johnny and Susie had ran into their mother's office to explain what was going on, and she was busy. So she let them on out of her office and she continued on working, where they said, "We have to figure this out." So I'll continue reading. It's a long story, so bear with me. The next thing the kids knew, they were scouring the house looking for clues as to what was going on. They started back in Susie's room. Everything looked normal and nothing seemed out of place. They checked in the closet and under the bed where monsters normally hid, but again, nothing. Finally, when they were giving up, it was all in their imagination, Johnny started to walk back towards the hallway. When he was almost there, he heard a creak in the wood floor. He stopped dead in his tracks and looked down. The floorboard looked like it had moved a little. He called Susie to come help him, and they began trying to remove the board from the floor. After several minutes of using their hands, they finally found the right tool to help them jar the board loose. Luckily for them, Susie's dolls were multi-purpose. They used her Barbie's arm and succeeded in removing the board from the floor. Then all the commotion began. First, the air began to move. Johnny's neck hair stood up, and Susie gave her brother a forlorn stare. They were sure whatever was under the floor was the key to understanding what or who was haunting their house. The children's breath was now showing up as steam every time they took a breath. The air became chilly, but they continued with their hunt for the truth. They looked down in the crevice, and there it was, a small leather bound book. It looked rough and slightly covered with dust. There was a small leather string attached to the back that wrapped around to the front, securing the book closed. Suddenly, a scream could be heard all around the room. "Leave my book alone!" It was a deep voice that sounded like pain itself. That's when the kids grabbed the book and ran. Johnny and Susie bounded down the stairs and out the front door. They knew they had to get out of the house and down the street to their safe space, the neighborhood playground. Luckily, the playground was deserted, so no one was going to bother them. They settled under the crossing bridge and began their investigation. They unwrapped the string and read the fancy lettering. "This book belongs to Josiah Stider." They looked at the date at the bottom, 1836. Susie did some quick calculations. It was over 200 years old. The book belonged to Josiah Stider, the ghost in their house. Were they related to Josiah? They had to find out. They left the playground and went to the library in their neighborhood to do some research. They walked in, and a familiar face was there to greet them, Mr. Smith. He had been in the library for as long as they could remember. He knew everything there was to know about the books in his care. The kids quickly ran up to him and began at once trying to explain what had happened in their house. Mr. Smith smiled and waited patiently until they both stopped talking. They looked at him with a confused look on their face when he didn't answer. Finally, after a moment, he stated, "I have no idea what you two just said." He chuckled a bit before asking Susie to re-explain what was going on. After a few moments, the librarian had all the information he needed. He asked to examine the journal they found and directed the children to the library archives. The archives area looked older than the rest of the library. It had a large rectangular table in the middle with a small desk lamp that gave light to any reader studying at the large space. Mr. Smith explained to the children that if they wanted to know more about Josiah Steider, they would find the information here. He set them on their task and left them to do their research. Now, I want you to see, guys, what's going on here. In the book, we're still doing more explaining. This is the rising action. It goes up where they're doing things and then goes back down where they're searching for things and then goes up when they find something and then back down. And now they're in the library and they're doing more research. So it's one of those things, rising action could happen for a while before you get to the big climax. So we'll continue. It was a long time before the children looked up. They had scoured book after book, deed claims and grants, but they finally found the document they needed. The census information they needed to trace their family back to the 1800s was where they found out they were indeed related to Josiah. He was their great 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 uncle. Now, the only information they needed to solve was why he was haunting their house. They did a little more digging and a few more books and found that he was a prize-winning frog racer. Frog racing was a big sport back in his time. Racers would come from all over the world bringing their fastest jumping amphibian. They would meet at the town square, set up a track, and have the fastest jumpers race against each other to win the coveted prize-winning trophy. This is where the story takes a twist. On the night of his death, Josiah was on his way to the races when he was met by a stranger who claimed to have the fastest frog in the world. Josiah knew he shouldn't trust a stranger, but he let his curiosity get the best of him. The stranger set his speedy frog loose against Josiah's, and Josiah's frog didn't stand a chance. The stranger's lightly green-colored frog was so fast, Josiah didn't know if any other jumper would be able to keep up. Without realizing it, Josiah reached out to grab the green streak, and upon touching it, his throat began to close. His eyes began to water, and his breathing became labored. Josiah knew something wasn't right. The stranger stood frozen in shock. He stared at Josiah for a second before realization hit. The stranger grabbed his frog and ran. He left Josiah on the street, gasping for breath and clenching his chest. Josiah only lasted a few moments before meeting his end. With everyone at the races, no one realized Josiah was dead on the street until morning. He didn't even get to race his frog, let alone win the trophy. The children looked up from the newspaper clipping they were reading and sat there shocked for a moment. What a sad way to go, they thought. After a few moments of silence, Johnny stood up and told Susie it was time to go. He had a plan. On his way home, he explained everything to his sister. They stopped at the pet store to collect the items they would need to exact his well laid out plan. They made it home and ran in the house. Everything was in chaos. Doors were opening and closing. Objects were flying around the room. The air was blowing out of control. The house was going mad like a child throwing an uncontrollable tantrum. The first thought that ran through the children's mind was their mother's safety. Where was she? Was she okay? Immediately, they ran to her office to check on her well-being. They found her at her desk, slumped over with her head down. The kids immediately feared the worst. They ran over to her, hoping their worst fears weren't true. Susie brushed her mother's hair aside, gave her a closer inspection. Her mother was breathing. A sigh of relief escaped both their mouths. Once Susie confirmed their mother was okay. For some reason, she was knocked out, and she didn't know why. They quickly ran out of her office back into the fray. They had to duck several items to dodge the potted plants, chairs, and other various household items. Their cat, Percy, flew by and gave a pleading meow as the children reached out to catch him. After missing him, Johnny thought to himself, "Poor Percy, we'll save you soon." They ran up the stairs towards Susie's room. At the top, An outline of her door was glowing. Something was happening inside, and the kids knew it was going to be something scary. They made it to the door and reached out to turn the knob. They pushed the door open, and there he was, Josiah Stider. He was floating in the middle of her room, a fog emanating from below his knees. His clothes were torn and frayed at the edges from years of being dead and long forgotten. His face was pale white, sunk in, and worms crawling from under his hat. The children looked in horror at the sight of Susie's room. Josiah let out a painful wail, and the air grew cold and frigid. Now, guys, as you can see, this is the climax. This is the big moment that you've been waiting for in the story. The confrontation between Johnny and Susie and Josiah. Johnny stepped closer and yelled, "I know who you are." "We can help you," said Susie. If Josiah heard the kids, he didn't show it. Johnny tried again. "Josiah Stider." Finally, the apparition stopped and took notice of the children before him. He looked down and smiled a wicked smile. Susie knew something bad might happen next, so she quickly pulled out of her bag the first of many things they gathered on their way home to exact Johnny's plan. It was a replica of the frog racing trophy, the same trophy given to the winner of the very race that he did not win when he met his untimely demise. That stopped Josiah in his tracks. Johnny took the opportunity to explain they were having a frog race, and the winner of the race would get this trophy. Josiah cried and tried to reach out to take the trophy from Susie, but she quickly backed away. "No!" she screamed. She explained that that they would race, and whoever won would win the trophy. Johnny added his last condition after she explained. Johnny said that if the ghost won, he would have to leave and go in peace. Josiah let out a scream and finally said okay before a blinding light filled the room. The kids found themselves in a different space. It was no longer Susie's room, but an arena they had never seen before. It was a crowded space with many people screaming in the audience. They were dressed in old attire from 1800s. Susie and Johnny were transported back to the town's arena from the newspaper clippings. It was the night of the race. The frogs were lined up at the starting line. The frog Johnny and Susie had brought home from the pet store was ready to go. The kids wanted to question how it got there, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting back home and making sure their home and family were safe. All at once, there was a loud bang. The race started. The crowd jumped to their feet, cheering and screaming for their favorite amphibian. Johnny and Susie looked with anticipation as their frog started out towards the finish line. They wanted so much for their frog to win, but really needed Josiah's frog to be victorious. Josiah's frog hadn't even left the start line. Susie looked to her brother and gave him a look of dread. What would happen if their uncle's frog didn't win? What would happen if their mom, or what would happen to their mom? Would she ever wake up from her unnatural slumber? She started to pull at her brother's arm when Josiah's frog took his first jump. As the other frogs were racing, Josiah looked. Oh, he told Josiah's frog may not make it. Why wasn't his frog jumping faster? Johnny thought. Suddenly, Johnny had an idea. He would have to help Josiah motivate his frog. Johnny screamed at his uncle to help his frog. He told Josiah to encourage his frog not to give up, to keep going. Josiah looked at his niece and nephew, unsure of what to do, but then made up his mind. He started cheering for his frog to go and to jump for the win. Suddenly, the frog began to hop like his feet were burning from hot coals beneath his body. Everyone wasn't sure if the frog would be able to catch up, but he was heading toward the goal. Johnny and Susie's frog was nearly at the end of the line. It was nearly over, but at the very last moment, Josiah's frog made one last big leap. It won at the very last moment. The crowd jumped to their feet, their arena filled with cheers, confetti, and streamers. This was the first time Johnny and Susie witnessed a positive change in their great uncle's behavior. The cold, dead, and withdrawn look began to melt and was replaced with that of a vibrant young man he was. Once cheering began to die down, A bright light once again filled the space. The children found themselves back in Susie's room, but things were different. The household items began flying around the room, were no longer in the air. I'm going to stop right there, and we're going to read this once we get together. But I'm going to let you know, as we've been reading, the climax was the race, the confrontation between Josiah, and now the falling action where he melts. There's a character change. This change in the character is Josiah going from the zombie like ghost to the regular ghost of their great uncle. And then he's going to get the winning trophy and he's going to then go in peace. And that is the resolution that they were looking for all throughout the story, how they were going to solve their problem of him going in peace. And that is how you complete the story and the plot. And I will continue this story once we get together and you can read it. All right, guys. So we just did Freytag's pyramid to help us to navigate plot, to build the sequence of events that make up a story. First, we started with the exposition, the introduction of characters, setting, and the conflict. And remember, setting is the place that the story happens. Then we have the rising action, the ups and downs of little events that lead up to the big main event, which is the climax. And in the climax, that's where Josiah meets them and they're in their race to see who will win the trophy. The falling action, where they get back to their house, Josiah, the character change, he changed from the zombie-like ghost to the regular ghost and then goes in peace. And once he goes in peace, that is the resolution. So guys, sorry for the long video, but we just did, studied, learned, and finished plot, a sequence of events that make up a story. Have a good day.